Good evening. A little tall for me. All right, here we go. Welcome. My name is Dr. Verna Marina Ehret, and I am the director of the Evelyn Lincoln Institute for Ethics and Society. The panel that you are here for tonight is called Individualism, Community, and the Power of Symbols, hosted by the Institute. So I want to thank all of you for joining us this evening. So just a little bit of background. Alias was established in the fall of 2008 through a generous grant from Emily and John Costigan. Emily Costigan is a 1964 graduate of Mercyhurst College, and the Institute is named in honor of her mother, Evelyn Jacobson Lincoln, who graduated from Mercyhurst in 1930, and is pictured here. Over the years, the Institute has engaged issues of socially responsible business practices, science and emerging technologies, ecology and sustainability, personal responsibility, and social justice. Before I introduce tonight's panel, I would like to thank the event staff, the marketing department for all of their assistance in putting together tonight's program, as well as the ambassadors who will be working with us tonight. I would also like to thank Mercyhurst University, President Getz, and Dean Riley Brown of the Hoffenmeyer College of Humanities, Arts, and Social Sciences for their support of the Institute. Our panelists tonight, Dr. Robert von Thayden, Professor of Religious Studies, Dr. Katie Duda, Assistant Professor of Russian Studies, Dr. Melissa Hairboth, Associate Professor of Psychology, and Dr. Julia Morgan, Assistant Professor of Philosophy. I'll be moderating tonight's panel, and after some brief introductory comments from each of the panelists, we'll give them each about 10 minutes to give you some framing for this discussion. We will turn to Q&A. And so the question and answer period will begin with some pre-written questions. While we are starting with those questions, the ambassadors will be available on the aisles with note cards. So if you have a question, just flag one of them down. They'll give you a note card, and then they'll bring it to me. So this way we can prevent the possibility of me mishearing your question. Being mindful of your time, the event will end by 8:30 this evening. So just a little bit of framing from me then about what we're talking about. I begin my philosophy of religion course with the idea that we live deeper than we think. What I mean is there is more to our lives than we are directly conscious of or paying attention to. Symbols frame our experience of the world. They point to something in our reality, but also affect how we interpret things. According to the theologian Paul Tillich, symbols also participate in the reality to which they point. So an American with a sense of national pride might look at the American flag and see a symbol of patriotism, of majesty, of pride, not just a symbol of the United States. They might feel those things. And ideas like liberty and individualism, it's going to be a good night, will immediately spring to mind. As the philosopher Paul Ricoeur said, symbols give rise to thought. They draw us into thinking, feeling, and even acting in a particular way. Symbols can give us a sense of belonging to something, but only if we accept the context of those symbols. The same symbols that create belonging for one person or group can exclude another. If you think of the Deus Vult cross, for example, the red cross on the white background, it is a symbol of the Christian Crusades. Deus Vult, meaning God wills it, was a way of identifying insiders to the perceived will of God. Those who were killed by the Crusaders, however, saw the symbol in a very different light. It is a symbol that has been revived today by certain religious right groups. The meaning of symbols changes by the context they are used in and can quickly become symbols of hate and violence. So, the image that we chose for the poster that was around campus is on the screen now, and is an example of the way that symbols can give rise to thought. Most of you are familiar with this image. It's the tanker truck that was, or the tanker that was stuck in the Suez Canal last year, and the tiny little crane that was trying to push it out of being stuck. And it became a meme that could be filled with any kind of content just by labeling the images. The picture itself, for many of you, elicits those memes, but if you are on the outside of meme culture, those meanings are not there. So a quick example of that, Dr. von Thayden posted this picture on social media, and one person commented on it, "I don't get why you chose that picture." It's a person outside of meme culture doesn't know what these memes possibly are. So this is what we are here to explore tonight. We'll be showing you some images of symbols that can have this dual effect of creating belonging while also marginalizing. We will contextualize them for you, but please be aware that we live deeper than we think. Images can have an emotional impact on us. So with that said, I will turn it over to our panelists. Dr. Fontaine?
I appreciate how Dr. Ehret suggests that someone didn't understand me, not because I was vague and opaque, but because they weren't participating in whatever culture I was trying to get at. I will not be showing images because the image I'm talking about, I'm assuming we can all picture it, and I would rather not have it up. All right, picture it. It's 1888, Madras, India. That's present-day Chennai to you and me. A Russian woman, Helena Petrovna Blavatsky, Madame Blavatsky, writes The Secret Doctrine. This is a text that will become required reading in certain European and American circles of those seeking secret and mystical knowledge about how the cosmos is put together. Blavatsky's system, known as Theosophy, promised esoteric knowledge about the true structure of the cosmos, and it came from that place where, sort of culturally, we know all secret wisdom comes from, the East. Blavatsky claimed that she was taught these secrets by two exalted spiritual masters named Moira and Kuthumi, who lived in the Himalayas. By the late 19th century, India and the language of Sanskrit had become a new source of scholarly and popular fascination, replacing Egypt in the popular imaginary. Blavatsky's occult interests followed suit, and she used what she claimed were sacred Hindu symbols to denote different phases of cosmic developments. Among the symbols she used for cosmic cycles were swastikas. Picture it, 1871, Hisarlik, Turkey. An amateur archaeologist, Hermann Schliemann, who, against all odds, decided that the Battle of Troy was a real battle, not some mythological one, discovers said city. This catapults him to fame in Europe. While excavating, if any of you are archaeologists, you are wincing because he used, delicate tools like crowbars and sledgehammers. While excavating, he finds a trove of repeated images on various artifacts, and he describes these images as swastikas. This earns him a rebuke from philologist, Indologist, and scholar of religion Max Müller. Müller worried that using the word swastika outside of its traditional religious or philosophical context on the Indian subcontinent would, in the words of Dr. Malcolm Quinn, quote, sever the links between the symbol and the tradition. Müller wrote to Schliemann, I do not like the use of the word swastika outside India. It is a word of Indian origin and has its history and definite meaning in India. I know the temptation is great to transfer names with which we are familiar to similar objects which come before us in the course of our researches, but it is a temptation which the true student ought resist, except it may be for the sake of illustration. The mischief arising from the promiscuous use of technical terms is very great, end quote. Now, I could launch into a long history about how certain strains of German Romanticism were activated to create a collective idea of a unified German culture, a unified German people, das Volk, whose political unity seemed out of grasp in much of the 19th century, and that when a certain political unity was achieved by the Prussian Bismarck in 1871, it was one that left large swaths of ethnic Germans in Austria out of the mix. And we could further talk about how, therefore, a folkish ideology begins to develop based on perceived peoplehood, or to use Darwinian language, a perceived common race. And at this time, when some ethnic Germans were threatened by the new worlds that industrialization, modernity, urbanization, and a cosmopolitanism whose ethnic and racial diversity, quite frankly, scared the hell out of them, I could go on to talk about how in that environment, men such as Guido List or Jörg Lanz von Liebensfeld combined German folkish nationalism with occult notions borrowed from Blavatsky in order to prophesy and vindicate a coming of a German world rule. This world rule, it turns out, would last only 12 years, and it would violently march out under the banner of a swastika. I could do that, but I don't have time. I only have 8 minutes. So I just want to say this, that as early as 1891, men like Michael Smigrodzki had appropriated the swastika as a symbol of the pure Aryan German race. And by 1919, a dude by the name of Adolf Hitler makes it the center of his party's flag. As he writes in his turgid and poorly written manifesto, Mein Kampf, I myself, after innumerable attempts, laid down the final form, a flag with red background and a white disc and a black swastika in the middle. After long trials, I also found a definite proportion between the size of the flag and the size of the white disc, as well as the shape and thickness of the swastika. Remember, Hitler fancied himself an artist once upon a time. Hitler repurposes the colors of the previous Bismarckian Empire to become the colors that will house the symbol of his third empire, the Third Reich, the swastika. By the time Hitler makes the swastika a central symbol of the Nazi Party, we have lost much of the esoteric woo-woo, that's a technical term I learned in grad school, woo-woo, of earlier mystical, romantic attachment to the symbol. What does carry over, however, is racist anti-Semitism that various permutations of Germanish folkish ideology developed and deployed. In many circles, a German folk, it seemed, needed to be constructed in opposition to a racial inferior other, be it Jews or Slavs or Romani or so forth. Thus, when Hitler redesigns his flag as a whole, the swastika became the one element which differentiated his flag from generalized German nationalism. And it could be detached without losing its significance. And the significance, this is, I'm quoting scholar Dr. Quinn, the significance did not depend on decoding the historical reference of the black, white, and red, but rather upon a cognitive and emotional gestalt. That is a whole thing. You took it all in. You didn't have to think about what it meant. It sort of meant what it looked like. The swastika was a sign in which a modern mass of Germans could see themselves as part of an ancient and noble community. So the swastika then becomes an affective symbol. As Dr. Ehret noted, it produces feelings. Dr. Quinn again, quote, the swastika is not so much read as reacted to and has assumed a causality in its own right rather than being seen as an image whose presence can be accounted for with a viable explanation. It is a symbol that produces feelings, of belonging, of purpose, of identity, of superiority. And that last feeling is where I want to dwell. The swastika became the banner not of small groups of utopian-minded romantics who were quirky, albeit deeply racist, but of a fascist war machine. It created community and belonging, a folk, by creating an absolute other, Jews. It was an anti-Semitic sign simultaneously as it signaled Aryan German identity, or perhaps better, it signaled Aryan German identity by being an anti-Semitic sign. It was the symbol of self-purported Übermenschen, superhumans, who in their own fevered imaginings were singled out by divine or cosmic destiny to be the rightful rulers of the planet. They were a folk called to exterminate or enslave the vast panoply of Untermenschen, inferior humans. That brutal history has attached itself to the symbol of the swastika, and no amount of crying out, damn spot will change that. It is now, in a European and Euro-American context, ever linked to the practice of turning individuals into a cohesive community through mass murder. It is a symbol that can only assert violent domination by those who deploy it. To quote Dr. Quinn again, the obscene grotesque of the Nazi swastika was and still remains a violent but hopeless gesture. The image can be reinscribed as it has been on postboxes in London, toilet walls in Berlin, and war graves in Holland, but this remains the only possible way in which a Nazi swastika can be read. So how did a symbol that appears in the warp and woof of human history throughout a vast array of cultures across continents and centuries, where it was often linked to expressions of fertility, good fortune, how did this become a symbol of death and hate? History is a funny thing. And human creativity and ability to remake and reuse a symbol is astonishing, even if that astonishment is more akin to horror. And the fact remains, as Quinn notes, even if we could make a detailed map about how it happened, it would in some sense be beside the point. The bell cannot be unrung. What is done cannot be undone. And the terror of what it can mean cannot be erased from those communities whose ancestors were exterminated under its watch. What a swastika might have meant once upon a time is not what it means in our context. The symbol was wrested from its native context and firmly set in a new one. What it once technically meant is not what it means. In our context, the only way it creates community is through hate, violence, and death, allowing one community to indulge in its pathetic self-delusions that it is somehow superior to other humans. At this moment and place in history, I posit, the only response to such a symbol as that is rejection. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Dr. Von Thayden. I am reminded that last semester I mentioned to a student when I didn't want to answer his question that maybe you could answer his question, and he said, wait, can he come and guest lecture in this class? So I'm sorry that I might not be able to match the energy. Tonight I'm going to start out with telling you what I am not going to talk about. This talk is not about the compelling culture created by and in support of Russia's LGBTQ population. While I will look closely at an example of such product at the end of my talk, I will only scratch the surface. Instead, tonight's talk focuses on anxieties about cultural hegemony and the use of the globalized LGBTQ symbol as a visual proxy for that concern. Specifically around the worldwide adoption of the 6-colored rainbow pride flag adapted from the 8-colored flag created by Gilbert Baker in 1978. Before I get to the key moments of this trend, I want to say one more thing about what this paper is not. It is not about public opinions about gay rights in Russia. Russia is a big country, and it struggles to agree on much. While there are some in Russia who threaten and harm LGBTQ persons and the views on LGBTQ matters are not a settled thing. The laws and actions of people with a lot of power suggest that Russia is a dangerous place to be out. At the same time, Russia continues to produce and explore sexual and gender identity in and around LGBTQ communities connected through art, activism, and of course, social media. These efforts, as the community itself emphasizes, are authentically Russian, and Russianness does not preclude queer identity. Queer Russian culture is part of Russian culture and deserves deeper study than my talk will give it this evening. I do hope to look at the tangle of official discourse, which can often be hateful, and lay ground for understanding LGBTQ culture in Russia over and above global iconography. I do have some slides. There we go. The Rainbow Pride flag first made a public appearance in Moscow on August 22nd, 1998, at the end of a Flag Day parade. Gay and lesbian Muscovites were invited to participate at the end of the parade, according to the newspaper Moskovskaya Komsomolets, by organizers who wanted to end the event with something unofficial and spontaneous seeming. And gays and lesbians seemed like they fit the bill because they were jolly and life-loving. That is a direct quote. Behind the scenes, there was about a month of negotiating before the city officials gave their blessing, while of course still trying to maintain some kind of control. On the street, though, according to Moskovsky Komsomolets, the reception was enthusiastic. The article highlights how an old woman asked people carrying the flag where she could get such a beautiful flag so that she could give it to her granddaughter. Meanwhile, foreign businessmen looked on in disbelief, not really sure that Russians truly understood the meaning of that flag. The author draws parallels to American LGBTQ history, signaling the 1998 event indicated burgeoning liberation for Russian gay rights, paralleling other movements worldwide. However, between 1998 and 2013, that hope receded, as did an imagination that Russia would or even wanted to participate in worldwide cultural trends. In the mid-2000s, Russia watched with chagrin as first Georgia, followed by Ukraine and Kyrgyzstan, staged, quote, color revolutions. Putin would go on to condemn these as interference from the West and often use sex as a stand-in for international relationships. In 2005, Putin played right into an association of color, sex, and homophobia by implying that a homosexual revolution would be next, playing on the word goluboy in Russian, which can be translated as light blue, but is also a slang term for gay men. Fast forward to 2013, when Russia infamously passes its prohibition of distribution of gay propaganda to minors. And this is drafted by a legislator named Yelena Mizulina, and while I don't expect us to know who that is, she's responsible for two big pieces of legislation in the early 2010s, this piece of legislation and the piece of legislation that prohibited adoptions of Russian children by foreigners. The enactment of this law famously saw colorful protests from the likes of Pussy Riot and deteriorating diplomatic relations, especially ahead of the 2014 Olympics in Sochi. Internally, it forced a number of organizations into reimagining their own iconography. Because, of course, the rainbow is not only used in flags that support gay rights. Two instances come to mind. The first is the Patriots of Russian Party flag, which you see up on the slide, and the second is the flag of the Jewish Autonomous Oblast in the far east of Russia. Excuse me. The Patriot of Russia Party would eventually change their branding in 2015, getting rid of the rainbow flag we see on the right and replacing it with the hero ribbon that actually, on left, right, my left, yeah, the hero ribbon on the right. The hero ribbon is something that Russians hold on Victory Day. They pin it to their clothes, they tie it to their cars. It's a sign of Soviet resistance to the Nazi aggression during World War II. The second example is one that is still in existence today, and that is the flag of the Jewish Autonomous Oblast. It has retained this flag since 1996, but it does so despite regular complaints filed against it that it has an association with the LGBTQ pride flag. And it has these associations have led it to detail in every time it officially appears as to what this flag means. This includes a list of what each of the 7 colors means, as well as highlighting the small strips of white that divide the colors. To summarize, by 2015, rainbows were most certainly out. Since 2013, though, Russia and the West have only grown more acrimonious. Sure, if we're following any news at all, this seems like a pretty whitewashed version of reality right now. Whatever may be held suspiciously as Western is now overtly denounced as such. And the rainbow then has been pushed further and further to the edges of Russian society. A few things stand out in the recent sort of 5 years. In 2017, legislation was again passed outlawing, not entirely sure how this works in reality, but it is definitely used as an excuse to punish people, which is the outlawing of the Putin gay meme, often called a clown, Putin clown, in 2017. And in 2020, the ice cream brand Rainbow, here we see Raduga, came under fire from the head of the women's union because she said it created a positive association for children with the rainbow symbol. She said there was no need to associate it with outright propaganda, but rather that positive attitude was sufficient to give it some sort of suspicion. And here I will quote her, I have, quote, a negative attitude toward the rainbow as well as toward the swastika, which is currently banned, although many centuries ago, this fascist sign meant well-being and fertility. The loose association of the rainbow pride flag and the supposed Western aggression was made clear, though, in 2020 when the U.S. Embassy in Moscow displayed a pride flag publicly in June. Muscovites snapped some pictures, which included kissing same-sex couples in colorful costumes that mirrored the colors of the flag. While we have descriptions of these images, many of them have unfortunately since disappeared from Instagram. Putin, meanwhile, took the opportunity to mock the flag and the US, implying through homophobic associations a weak America. I will argue, or I do argue, though, that this implication is what spurred, again, members of Pussy Riot to display the rainbow flag all over Moscow in October to celebrate Putin's 68th birthday. They put it, among other places, the Presidential Administration Building, the building of the FSB. And while Western press liked to highlight that this was in support of gay rights in Russia, and I believe that to be very much so, I believe even internally, it has this power of parodically imitating Putin's very base association of gay pride with weakness. Globalized symbols have left queer communities in Russia subject to association of Western influence. One that those communities are very much aware of, and important aspects of contemporary queer culture have to lay claim to being authentically Russian. And I have to say that in Russian culture, this is not the first time that marginalized groups have had to do this. We see Jews, Germans in the imperial period having to do this as well. There are periods also when Jews once again have to do this in the Soviet period. So there is a rich cultural history of having to lay claim to something being authentically Russian, something internal. And so I'm going to end with this illustration. Here I have a snapshot from a 2020 web series translated in English as Here I Am, about students in Moscow. In the opening episode, two young men, Roma and Lyosha. Lyosha is the one closest to me. Roma is a little bit further from me. They end up hooking up after meeting each other the morning after a party. Roma is a pizza delivery man and a student, a law student, and he explains that at the party they ate all the pizza. Lyosha, his new friend, mentions how he doesn't really care because he doesn't like pizza. He really prefers traditional spelt porridge, quote, a classic Russian cuisine. Roma, in turn, compares that porridge to Armenian harissa, which is another kind of porridge, one that many families make in tandem with memorials for the Armenian genocide. This conversation is significant because it primes viewers to see both men as young people seeking authenticity, not only in sexual identity, which is in no way secondary to that search, but multivalently. While the web series will go on to explore their lives against a modern backdrop of universally recognized signifiers of contemporary culture, this initial conversation reminds viewers that cultural tradition remains a constructive aspect of authenticity and complements characteristics of young people seeking to understand themselves. Thank you.
Good evening. I'm Melissa Hairboth, and I'm a psychologist, and I'm going to focus my remarks on why people are motivated to display symbols and the impact that seeing particular symbols can have on marginalized groups. So, why are people motivated to display symbols? 3 reasons, really. First, to communicate enthusiasm about something. In individualistic cultures such as the United States, we speak of individuals as having a transmitter orientation. And that is, they've been socialized to express their beliefs and preferences and passions proudly. We put stickers on our laptops and water bottles. We wear t-shirts of our favorite bands and brands. We decorate our high school lockers, the walls of our room, our offices, because it's simply part of North American culture to transmit information about ourselves. Interestingly, in other cultural contexts, listening is emphasized more than transmitting. Social psychologists theorize that the reason that we like to transmit so much in individualistic cultures like the United States is because we derive a sense of self-concept and self-esteem by identifying ourselves with things that we like. Secondly, we display symbols to signal our values and beliefs to others, potentially helping to connect ourselves with like-minded others. When I see someone with a symbol of my hometown, a Red Sox hat, the symbol signals to me that I can connect with that one person over at least one thing, right? That special place or that special team. So symbols can help bring people together. Third, a sense of control or domination over a space can be achieved by displaying symbols. Research shows that when we see a symbol in a social space, we overestimate the strength of the attitude of the person displaying the symbol. So when we encounter a person flying a flag of a political candidate, we actually assume that the level of devotion to the candidate is much stronger than the person who flying the flag thinks it is. We encounter a person wearing a team jersey and we tend to think that the fandom is stronger than it is. So we overestimate the strength of support that the displayer has for the symbol. But we also overestimate how widespread that particular attitude or value is. So for example, when we're driving through a neighborhood and there are 2 campaign signs for the same candidate, we tend to think that there are a lot of people who live in that neighborhood that support that candidate. When we see a bumper sticker with an offensive slogan, we tend to think that there are significantly more people who think that slogan is acceptable than there really are. So we also come to overestimate how popular the particular value or attitude expressed by the symbol is. Hate symbols are no different from any other type of symbol. People use them for all 3 of those reasons: to communicate their identification with a particular ideology or set of values or group, which then gives them a sense of self-concept and inclusion and maybe even self-esteem, to identify themselves to others, and then to dominate or control a space by making people think that the amount of supporters for that symbol is vast and the strength of that attitude is tremendous. As the internet and social media has proliferated, hate has moved online, where it's easier and far more efficient to find like-minded people, and where people can polarize or radicalize by talking to only like-minded people and developing worldviews that are not grounded in reality. To combat this, social media platforms are trying to moderate content. Not following the rules of the platform means that you can get banned, and so users of hate symbols have had to become more covert and less direct. The phenomenon of people using coded or suggestive language in political messaging in order to garner support from particular groups without provoking opposition is known as dog whistling. Just like actual dog whistles that are ultrasonic to human ears but are detectable by dogs, dog whistles in political speech refers to messaging that appears to be normal to the majority but communicates specific things to intended audiences. It's not always a bad thing. A famous example of dog whistles in advertising comes from Subaru. Before there was widespread support for gay marriage, Subarus have always been popular with the LGBTQ crowd. Subaru ran ads with car license plates that said things like P-Town, referring to Provincetown, Massachusetts, a popular and long-established vacation spot for the LGBTQ crowd. Saturdays are for the boys is the dog whistle. It expresses a certain sentiment recognizable to people who consume certain media, but it's not an outright ban on women. Saturdays for the boys sounds better than let's not fully include women. Famously, in 1981, Lee Atwater, a Republican strategist, revealed Nixon's use of dog whistles. In an anonymous interview, Atwater said that in the 1950s, it was socially acceptable for white candidates to use the N-word in campaign speeches in order to rile up fear and anger in voters. By the 1960s, that was no longer acceptable, and so candidates had to use those same anger and fear-evoking messages without explicitly invoking race. So they started talking about forced busing and states' rights. People who were strongly motivated by a desire for segregation still understood what you were talking about and would recognize you as the candidate for them. So what is the effect of hate symbols and language on marginalized groups? Do these symbols actually have the power to cause harm? Here's what we do know. Social psychologists have spent decades conducting highly controlled experimental research on the question of the effects of exposure of hate symbols on marginalized groups. Claude Steele at Stanford University has made a career demonstrating that students who are reminded of a negative stereotype of the group that they belong to, for example, women being reminded that they are thought to be bad at math, right before they take an important test, underperform on those tests compared to students who are not reminded of those stereotypes. We're talking about the SAT, the GRE, right, other placement exams that have important consequences. There have been studies demonstrating that even seemingly positive associations between stigmatized and marginalized groups harm members of those groups. Some researchers presented Native American subjects with one of several stereotypical portrayals, including Chief Wahoo of the Cleveland Indians and Disney's Pocahontas. A control group of Native American subjects saw different images that did not feature stereotypical portrayals of their group. Participants who viewed one of the stereotyped images of Native Americans expressed lower self-esteem, less pride in their community, and fewer achievement goals compared with those who did not see those images. In other words, despite looking fun and harmless, the portrayals of Native Americans appeared to elicit stereotype threat. Native Americans felt worse about themselves and their communities because the stereotyped representations communicated the limited ways in which others see them. Given that the Native tribes are a relatively invisible minority group to most Americans because they represent a small percentage of the population, often live on isolated reservations, and rarely appear in mainstream media, any stereotype portrayal can greatly influence the way that other people perceive them as a cultural group. Even if they're the product of good intentions, caricatures and stereotyped images can sometimes have negative consequences. Theorists in psychology have argued that a logical and rational response to feeling marginalized and stigmatized is to not spend a ton of energy fighting back. Martin Seligman's theory of learned helplessness, John Jost's system justification theory both agree that if you are a Native American child and Pocahontas is the primary mechanism through which your country, outside of your immediate group, views you, well, how do you even begin to address this? For every brave soul that's speaking up, there are many more who feel like their efforts would not matter, which is a depressing state to be in. We know that people who routinely experience prejudice experience significantly more symptoms of stress and even die earlier from the physical toll that the stress of being discriminated against puts on the body. Further complicating the picture is the level of vitriol that can happen whenever individuals feel that their rights to do anything are being curtailed. A lot of people just come to the conclusion that they don't want to deal with the trolls. So to summarize, we know that exposure to stereotypical, and especially negative stereotypical content, has real and consequential psychological, emotional, and behavioral impacts on people. Here's what we don't yet know. Now that covert symbols and messages are more prevalent because of social media, what are the psychological consequences? Do we become more exhausted and frustrated because of the burden of constantly having to second guess everything? What does something really, really mean? How are our civic ties being affected by the proliferation of symbols? It used to be that talking about politics was considered impolite. Now people fly flags with their candidate on it. How does this affect relationships between neighbors? Would you let your child go to the house of a person who's flying a flag of a candidate you absolutely hated? Or flying the flag of a dangerous object like an AR-15? How do your perceptions of your teachers change when you see their bumper stickers? How does all of this suddenly available information about people's ideological beliefs affect your trust in social institutions like education and government and healthcare or science? And what are the consequences when that social trust is eroded in these institutions? Thank you.
Okay, is it just the arrow? You just arrow or space to advance? Yeah, arrow. Arrow, okay. Thank you, Dr. Arrett, for inviting me to this panel. And thank you, my esteemed colleagues, for sharing space with me tonight. And thank all of you for coming out tonight. Symbols are meaningful precisely because they are a story, as we have heard tonight. And it is these stories that inform our actions in our daily lives. They give us guidance on how to live and what choices we make. The idea that symbols are just some harmless thing, just a burning cross, just a noose, just a Confederate flag, is in itself a story, and what I'd like to spend some time exploring. This harmless thing myth begins with the free speech clause of the First Amendment of the Bill of Rights of the U.S. Constitution.
Ironically, we have forgotten why our Constitution contains a provision for free speech when we loudly proclaim our right to that speech. While the debates around the First Amendment are not all that enlightening on this issue, Blackstone's commentaries on the laws of England are. Blackstone's commentaries were heavily relied upon by the drafters of the Constitution and influenced both courts and politicians in the early years of the nation. According to Blackstone's commentaries, free speech allows for the freedom of, quote, the will of individuals, end quote. However, there should be legal punishment when that free will is abused. Further, free speech limitations do not restrain, quote, the freedom of thought or inquiry, and the liberty of private sentiment should be left untouched. Speech should be limited when the disseminating or making public of bad sentiments is destructive to the ends of society. In other words, the First Amendment's right to free speech was designed to ensure that all voices are heard, not just the loudest, not just the angriest, and not just the ones with guns. But, as Blackstone notes, the First Amendment also was based on our free will to express, with limitations. This notion of free will has morphed over the years. Much of the languaging we see used in both court opinions and on the streets seems to hold that I choose when I am harmed by words and symbols, and as such, it is not up to the government to protect me from these marks. Words and symbols are empty of all meaning, and they have no power unless I give them power. The burden of engagement has shifted from the one acting to the one being acted upon. But this new sense of ultimate free will and choice belies the real impact of symbols and corresponding words, as we have heard tonight. For words and symbols are part of an endless cycle. Words and symbols come from thoughts, which come from beliefs, and those beliefs are crafted into the stories we tell and subsequently the actions we take. Changing any one of these, actions, symbols, thoughts, beliefs, will impact the others. Certain symbols simultaneously fill one group with a sense of superiority and another with a sense of dread that rises in the face of exclusion. And this occurs because symbols are tiered and intersectional, which is to say, there are many stories around every symbol. Take this flag. Oopsie, not that flag. This flag. It's the thin blue line flag. According to Asenwal and Chama at the Marshall Project, the flag was crafted in 2014 by a white college student to support police who seemed to be targeted after the murder of George Floyd. Actually, this would have been before the murder of George Floyd, but they were being targeted. And though ambush killings of police have declined more than 90% since 1970, they still felt that there needed to be support. The term thin blue line can be traced to the 1950s film of the same name, which exposed the rampant racism at the LA Police Department at the time. In 1988, Errol Morris directed the documentary The Thin Blue Line, where the line represented both that which saves the public from anarchy and a closed, insular space behind which our own are protected. To be clear, I'm not saying that police should not be commended for their actions when they act according to the color of law and in the best interests of their communities, nor am I saying that we should ignore the dangerous job policing has become when approximately 44% of all U.S. households have a legal gun, actually an average of 5 legal guns per household. I am saying that we need to be aware of what this thin blue line says to all of society, not just a few. As Melina Abdullah, co-founder of the Los Angeles chapter of Black Lives Matter, stated about the thin blue line flag, it feels akin to a Confederate flag. Abdullah is not alone in her expression of exclusion, as small precincts have debated whether putting the thin blue line decal on police cars would result in individuals not asking for help. The sense of exclusion is not simply the result of an overly sensitive group of people. It has become the very purpose of the flag for some. Dallas Police Sergeant Stephen Bishop stated, quote, "When I see the flag as a sticker on a car or flying in someone's yard, I know that there is someone there that knows what I'm going through. They know because they are part of the family. I don't really care if it bothers people or hurts their feelings to see that flag. I absolutely could care less. I am proud of what I do, the people I work with, and the ones who have died defending the rights of strangers. I will continue to fly that flag until my very last day. Legally, Bishop and others have a right to fly this flag, just as they have a right to fly the Confederate flag. But is there nothing more that needs to be said on this issue? What are the First Amendment concerns over abuse of our free will under the guise of rights? Or what of the ethical question of whether I should or whether I ought to fly this flag? We are almost completely consumed with our notion of rights in this country and forget the flip side of the coin, duty. Rights do not come out of thin air. They do not magically appear to be used with impunity. In his famous speech, I Have a Dream, Dr. Martin Luther King used the imagery of a bad check. He said, "It is obvious today that America has defaulted on this promissory note, insofar as her citizens of color are concerned. Instead of honoring this sacred obligation, America has given the Negro people a bad check, a check which has come back marked insufficient funds. But we refuse to believe that the Bank of Justice is bankrupt. We refuse to believe that there are insufficient funds in the great vaults of opportunity of this nation. And so we've come to cash this check, a check that will give us, upon demand, the riches of freedom and the security of justice." The bank account that King's check was drawn upon is one of duty, and it empties if we do not make deposits. So how do we fill and refill this account? Judge Learned Hand, who played a large role in crafting the laws around the First Amendment in his famous speech in 1944, The Spirit of Liberty, shared with his audience that he often wondered, quote, "whether we do not rest our hopes too much upon constitutions, upon laws, and upon courts. These are false hopes. Believe me, they are false hopes. Liberty lies in the hearts of men and women, and when it dies there, no constitution, no law, no court can save it. No constitution, no law, no court can even do much to help it. While it lies there, it needs no constitution, no law, no court to save it." And what is this liberty which must lie in the hearts of men and women? It is not the ruthless, the unbridled will. It is not the freedom to do as one likes. That is a denial of liberty, and it leads straight to its overthrow. A society in which its people recognize no check upon their freedom soon becomes a society where freedom is the possession of only a savage few. Hand goes on to define the spirit of liberty. The spirit of liberty, he says, is the spirit which is not too sure that it is right. The spirit of liberty is the spirit which seeks to understand the minds of other men and women. The spirit of liberty is the spirit which weighs their interest alongside its own without bias. The spirit of liberty remembers that not even a sparrow falls to earth unheeded. And so the spirit of liberty, which gives rise to freedom and rights, is what we must embrace in order to fulfill what is our duty to the nation. This means recognizing our responsibilities to others, seeking to understand others, seeking to weigh the interest of others along with our own. We fill the coffers of duty in no other way. So yes, you have a right to fly the Confederate flag. Oopsie. Whoop. You even have a right to have your prom picture taken with it. But so too do you have a duty to understand the pain such an action creates. Moreover, if you do fly this flag, you must support the right of others to kneel during the national anthem in sorrow for lives lost, like that of Amir Locke, and peoples imprisoned, and neighborhoods left behind. The other side of that coin that we use to claim our rights is emblazoned with duty, and part of duty is to not only transmit, but is to listen to the pain of our fellow citizens, to allow this listening to form thoughts and mandate action. For our nation to survive as a democracy, freedom cannot be limited to withdrawal of rights, but must be bolstered by deposits of duty. Thank you.
All right, so let's have a conversation. What we're going to do now is I have some prearranged questions that we'll start with, and the presenters too, as you have questions for each other, please feel free to jump in with those. while we're doing that, the ambassadors are going to be on either side here. Just raise your hand and then we'll hand you a card. You can write your question, they'll bring it up to me. We good? All right. So let's start with some basic questions about how we engage these symbols. We have looked at specific examples of symbols in both Germany and Russia. We have looked at the impact of these symbols and the moral questions raised by how we use them. So if we go back to Dr. von Theden's presentation, how do people for whom the swastika is an ancient religious symbol within their tradition negotiate the meanings that the symbols prompt based on its use by Nazis and current white supremacists? In other words, can we still use these symbols that are grounded in ancient cultures when they have been given all of this other baggage?
I can't use it. I think that's the simplest way. Someone who looks like me in my cultural context cannot use it. The question then becomes, though, what happens for those folks who are non-European, non-Euro-American, whose families and culture are not implicated by this? How do they do it? What, in a sense, is, in some sense, symbolic imperialism. It didn't get in because I didn't have time. But there's a Buddhist teacher, T.K. Nakagaki, and he has a book, The Buddhist Swastika and Hitler's Cross. He goes to great lengths to say that the Nazis didn't use a swastika, they used a cross. In German, it's Hakenkreuz, it's a hooked cross. And he wants to make a big distinction between that terminology. Again, remember Müller's concern with Schliemann's use of the term swastika. But I couldn't fit it in, but here's a line that he says here. He says, the symbol of the swastika since the 20th century has become so conflated with evil, Hitler, and anti-Semitism that its ancient origins and continued positive benevolent meanings for Buddhists, Hindus, Jains, and others that exist aside from Hitler's distortion and desecration have been lost or banished from contemporary conversation. And here's the kicker. While we must be cautious to never forget the history of the swastika's usage by Hitler and others as an instrument of evil, we must also beware of permanently reassigning this Western meaning to the symbol in a way that silences Asian tradition. So I don't have an answer to that question. I know this. I could never use that symbol. I think in different cultural settings, it's going to carry different meanings. Now, the other side of that coin, though, is, for example, in sort of prepping for this, Katie Engelhardt had a piece in 2010 in the Plains magazine that talks about that on the Indian subcontinent, Hitler's Mein Kampf, a translation of it, is selling like hotcakes. So the question then becomes, how is the distinction that Nakagaki is making ever complete? And so I don't know the answer. It's important to think about that kind of cultural imperialism, that Europeans took a symbol that has deep and ancient resonances in multiple cultures, not just Asian cultures, indigenous North American cultures. And what do you do with that? And I'm not sure. Again, I think that's where context matters. But I can say someone who looks like me can't ever use this one. Yeah.
Anyone else want to chime in?
So let me ask a slightly different question. When we look at the ways that symbols are used to disrupt society, thinking in terms of both Katie and Julia's presentations, what is the value of using certain kinds of symbols to disrupt society? And are there certain kinds of symbols that we should not be engaging as a disruption of society? Are they not the right kind of challenge to society, might we say?
Sure. I'm not sure. I hesitate to sort of put my own attitudes about what's appropriate symbols for Russians to use as a non-Russian, right? That's a position I'm not comfortable speaking from. But I think Julia, in her introduction, really kind of summed up the importance of symbols, even as global symbols, right? We see symbols that are understood globally to mean what we think fairly simple ideas, right? The support of LGBTQ rights. When that story is actually more complicated when we look at the dynamic in that cultural context. Yes, it means that, but because of its push to the margins, it then also has this other power, and this is why I kind of wanted to bring up the Pussy Riot Act in 2020, wherein they put the rainbow flag in front of these federal buildings. That is not just support of gay rights, as though that is meeting some sort of bare minimum. No, that I don't mean that. But that is also forcing the sort of official discourse, Putin-led discourse, which is always phallocentric, always about male dominance, into that ridiculous position that they have, that he himself has put himself in, right? To say, oh, if you hang a rainbow flag, that means you are gay and you are weak, when, we can easily turn that level of base discourse back on you. And so that symbol, that again, global symbol, means something specific in that context that can't easily be globalized from that.
Yes. I guess I'm trying to negotiate this idea of, if I understand the question correctly, like, are there symbols we can and can never use? Is that really what it is? And I would hesitate to take away freedom and free will and say, no, you can never do that as a prohibition, even the swastika, which is so painful, right? But instead argue that if we actually listened to the reactions of people to that symbol, we would recognize that we should not use it. You know, so in other words, I'm not going to say there's a universal prohibition on X, Y, and Z, but I am going to say that we as people of democracy, for one thing, but just as global citizens, we need to be far more aware of how our actions are impacting others. And I think in that process, we become more attuned to what is appropriate when and what is not.
Melissa, would you like to weigh in? Sure. I'll just yell. This conversation is happening right now with Joe Rogan, right? Who is in the position of having to apologize for, behavior on his podcast. And I think Trevor Noah from The Daily Show had an excellent piece today, actually, that he tweeted out, which was, the complicating factor, just the real world implication of when people just sort of like throw around a painful symbol is that, if you use this symbol in a way that is not intended, but you're using it to be funny or just to even talk about it, you're complicating the social reality for a lot of people. So now people have to navigate, is this person who's using this racist symbol actually racist or just using it as a joke? And it just makes it that much more cognitively demanding and difficult on marginalized groups that are seriously harmed by these symbols. And so I refer you to Trevor Noah's excellent take on this question from earlier today.
And adding to that, I would say that that's the kind of conversation we should be having before we can use this symbol. So, but it probably is too much to drink that Joe would.
So then connected to that, if we're teaching about hate symbols, there's a lot of symbols we did not show in this presentation and intentionally did not use them because they can be triggering, because they can be tremendously painful for various marginalized groups. If we are teaching about this in the classroom, most of the people in this room are our students or our colleagues, to what extent can we use these as a teaching tool to be aware of what they are? Can we show them in the classroom?
I think it depends on the symbol. And certainly if we're talking about some very well-known ones like the swastika or the N-word, there's no need. We know what those are. We don't need to show it. We don't need to say it. But maybe we're talking about a more esoteric symbol that people don't know what it is. And maybe we do have to make sure everybody's on the same page. And so I think it's hard. I mean, it's certainly one of my goals as a teacher is to make sure that you understand exactly what we're talking about. And if it's very veiled and we're just sort of assuming everybody knows, right, that does not help your learning. And so I would agree with Julia here that we don't want to ever limit and just put a blanket ban on it.
What do you think? For you, student.
I'm the moderator. I'm thinking.
There's a hand over there. I don't know. Somebody in the pink mask, I think, back there. The lights are bad.
I think it's beneficial to show them in classes because we were taught that to make history about itself, you have to learn about it. So to accurately talk about it, you have to see it.
There's another hand over there.
I think if we're going to talk about it, we need trigger warnings and for it to be mentioned before the class begins. Just for the fact that for some groups, it can be a really traumatizing experience, and we need that time to prepare for students.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, right? So I would do that for other things too, right? So those of you who had class with me, I teach Sophocles' Antigone, right? And so I tell them, yeah, there's a lot of death, and there's suicide at the end. So just be prepared for that. It's going to be difficult. But again, if we know that in the beginning, going in, then we're not shocked by it, so then we don't have an immediate affective response, and we can think through it. So I think that's a good way to think about it. I haven't put those two things together. That I do that already for other difficult things. So, you know, that probably seems to be the way to go, right? Because we don't want the veiledness, right? We don't want to not teach. We don't want to not do that kind of stuff. But we also don't want to needlessly harm people. So I think, yeah, that's a good thing. Because again, what's the whole point of trying to explain that? If something troubling is coming up, we want students to learn. And if you're having an emotional reaction to something because I didn't prep you for it, you're not learning. So again, that's kind of a good entree into that.
Other responses from the crowd?
I think you should show them and like say we're going to show, we're going to talk about today, triggering, it won't go outside, go outside, you don't have to have to see it, but people want to stay inside and learn about it, and that's really good because it's just more about the world, and I feel like this is ridiculous to try to privatize something if like it's bad in our society, and it's, I don't know how to read it. I know I beg for privatization, I feel like it's just wrong.
We can add to that question a little bit, this idea of the dog whistles that Dr. Hairboth was talking about. How do we become aware of those?
I have colleagues and friends who study hate groups, who study far-right groups, and I don't know how they do it. I honestly don't know how they're not raging alcoholics because of what they do. And they do it for this reason, because I think it goes back to what you all were saying. If we don't know, we don't know. And then you could have networking of groups that intend harm to others right under our noses, and we're not paying attention. And how do we have a duty to community if we don't know that there's something in the offing? There's a scholar in my field who talks about part of my field that's distasteful, and he says it sort of is, you know, like the plumber. I don't want to do it when my toilet gets clogged, but I'm really glad there's someone whose profession it is, which is my uncle, right? But I think that's kind of it, and it's hard. And I applaud folks who study and who manage to teach it in a way that, at least the couple of scholars I'm thinking of, manage to do it in a way that, to your point, contextualize, to your point, like, are not just doing it to give us shock value, but to try to make some sense of it so that we can actually pay attention to what's going on and we can learn stuff. So we're like, oh crap, I didn't know what that was. I thought, that was just this, that, the other thing. It turns out it's not. So yeah, again, I have friends who study that kind of stuff, and I don't know how they do it. I just don't.
Do we have questions from the? Okay, so thinking about the Joe Rogan situation, is it valuable to enforce the understanding of a community about a symbol? Does that make a difference to the community using the symbol? Want me to read that again?
Yes.
Thinking about the Joe Rogan situation, is it valuable to enforce the understanding of a community about a symbol? Does that make a difference to the community using the symbol? So, for example, I'm guessing that this question, if we talk about the Confederate flag in terms of it means states' rights versus it's a racist symbol. Can we teach a community about its own symbol? Whoever's question is that what you're getting at?
Yeah, you got it right. I realize now I kind of worded it weird, but yeah, you understood it right.
Yeah.
I think that would be yes, but I also don't know of any symbol that has one story. So the goal is to teach the multiple stories, or to talk about the multiple stories that each symbol has. Right? I mean, symbols are classic intersectionality. Like we heard from almost every single one of us talked about a different symbol that has multiple meanings. But I might not be answering what you're saying.
Well, I think it goes back to what you were arguing earlier, that I really sort of appreciate, and I think it builds on everything. It's almost like we knew what we were doing here.
That's why they put me at the end.
Is, again, this notion of duty to our fellow citizens, right? That's what I really think it kind of comes down to, right? Is maybe not teach someone the symbol, but to sort of make aware, look, this is how other people are reacting to that symbol. And that's got to be at least the first step.
And I think we live in a world where it's pretty, maybe I'm wrong, but it seems pretty easy to figure out how different people are reacting to different symbols, right? I mean, isn't that the glory?
I think,
Twitter and social media?
yeah, and I think that symbols are an interesting tool of communication, right, because of their multivalence. So that often when people double down on uses of symbols, comes down to the intention of trying to highlight a certain aspect of that story. However, that doesn't take into account what, Julia, you have been arguing is the way in which receivers understand that symbol. And there's no way to, as far as I know, there's no way to control that, right? That those stories are going to live side by side, and for certain readers and users of symbols, just symbols in general, will argue that one supplants the other, but they cannot actually make that claim for another person.
Other questions from the audience?
If you apply words like swear words to symbols, because like the F word, like I don't know, did I hear it makes me like, I don't know, if I listen to it, it makes me kind of not feel good. But like, should we be more about those, like trying to talk about like their multiple stories or whatever?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are gradations. I think it all goes back to what Dr. Martin said, right? If we are good global citizens, we're good neighbors. We're raised like I'm sure our moms raised us when she sent us off to elementary school. It's to pay attention to the effect it has. So if you're with friends, you may use, if we're talking about swear words, you may use certain things with your friends because that's a joke. But like, right, I'm sure you all rag on your friends, right? You all have sarcasm with your friends, you all have that kind of stuff. But if you just said that to someone you don't know, that doesn't work, right? The relationship isn't there to get the humor. So the more you're talking, the more we keep talking, the more I think it just keeps going back to that. And again, Dr. Hairboth's notion of listening versus transmitting, too, is listening helps. Because again, it would be nice to think that most of us, if we were in a situation where we were told, look, this is making me uncomfortable, this is hurting me, that we all take a step back and be like, oh, geez, I didn't know. Let me do better. I know better, so I can do better. Kind of situation.
And I think, I mean, some people will recognize that their words or their use of symbols will have a negative impact on others and enjoy that, right? That's part of psychology. We are the people that study hate, that we're in the trenches doing it. And there are people that just enjoy that sense of being provocative or being negative toward another person. But I think what we also have to realize is that even if you're that type of person that just enjoys being provocative, enjoys that sense of power that can come from making other people feel triggered or feel bad, you too lose something. Because this is all kind of fraying at the social fabric. If we no longer trust science or our government or these institutions that just help us live our lives, we're all paying a cost from that. So it's coming back to hurt everybody in some way. And I think we do tend to focus, what's most salient to our own thoughts or my rights, what I get to do, what's best for me, and we're not socialized as much in individualistic cultures to focus on how our behaviors can impact others. And the whole world, this is an interesting and troubling statistic for me, is that all cultures seem to be moving toward more individualism. Even the United States, which has the highest recorded individualism in the world, where everyone's marching toward it. And this is a dangerous place, I think.
So I will make just a kind of slight caveat in space for aggressive language. I don't know how else to say it. A couple weeks ago, I ended class with a little presentation about a sort of rampant meme. You can look it up, which is Putin, which translates to, and I apologize for the roughness of this language, Putin is a dickhead. And there's a lot of, in the memes, there's a lot of very explicit, we could call it adolescent drawing of what that means. But that has a place because of the terms that Putin himself sets out for discourse. As I mentioned before, when you become phallus number one, then you become phallus number one. And that is, and I think that's also important as somebody who studies and also teaches a culture like Russian and Soviet culture that is known as totalitarian, to look at points of discourse that can be used in parodic, crude, and sort of ways that push back. Now, that doesn't mean that I want to encourage anyone to use, and I'll say this again, the Russian term "huilo" outside of its sort of being said of Putin, right? In fact, I don't really want you to say it about Putin. I just want you to know that that sentence exists. And so we do have to have space for some of this as analytic discourse, right? That this kind of thing has a particular power and how that power dynamic works. At the same time, it's not to be, and as a language teacher, I would feel remiss as I taught students further and further in a language to make them aware that there are words that you can use to insult people, and people will use them to insult you, and you should be aware of that. Use that at your discretion, or as I like to say, you don't know what the power they have, so don't use them, and instead get used to saying, how are you not ashamed? But yeah, so we have to, it can be unpleasant, it can be uncomfortable, but those types of things exist in culture and should be acknowledged as such, and for the power they have.
I think that's what I was trying to get at with the juxtaposition of the Confederate flag, although I didn't have it at the top, and the kneeling, is that, my guess is that many of the supporters of the Confederate flag did not support Colin Kaepernick. Did I say that right? Right, did not support the kneeling, right? Even after they heard the story of why he was kneeling. And because of that, they sort of self-exclude themselves, right? So if we're going to support something that is so hate-filled, it makes it almost impossible to support any pushback on that, right? If that makes sense. So it would almost be self-legislating, right? If we're going to do this correctly. We're going to be talking.
So related to that a little bit, another question from the audience. With social media and overt and covert provocations that we see in a variety of ways, how do we expect to make these known if we're afraid to discuss them? And many of us are anxious about talking about these things. So how do we get over that anxiety and talk about them?
Well, again, I think context does matter, right? Classrooms, spaces with your peers, these are places where you can explore things. Having a conversation in person is also a way to help avoid misunderstanding, I would think. I'm sure we've all had that experience where we're sort of like, look, this is too complicated, or I don't want you to, or we send something in writing, we text, or send through other kind of digital media, we send something, and our friends or our acquaintance totally misunderstand what we're saying because they missed the tone. So I think in situations like that, right, it would make sense to be in those spaces. I think sort of just randomly having conversations with into the ether is more complicated. I think sort of that's where I think social bonds come in, and duty to one another is having those things. Those are good spaces to have those kinds of discussions.
And for those of you who are my students, you would use the toolkit. But yeah, definitely, I think building relationships is really important. Even if it's with someone who's diametrically opposed to what we believe in, right? The ability to have a conversation is actually part of what it means to be in a community. And with no community, we have no democracy. So everything that learner can was worried about will occur.
And I spend like all of my time thinking about that question as a psychologist. And lately, given the concerns about polarization and radicalization and prejudice in society, I've been teaching courses related to this. What I've been spending a lot of time thinking about is how do we harness like skills from clinical psychology to help facilitate those conversations. And I think it's also important to recognize that these are incredibly difficult things to do. And there are people that have years and years and years of training that also recognize how difficult it is, and that if the conversation goes poorly, it's going to backfire, and you can make people dig deeper and entrench deeper into their beliefs. And so there's an element of being able to choose the situation of when you can have a conversation and when it's probably best to back off. I'm getting really excited by some research coming out of Columbia University. There's it's called the Difficult Conversations Lab, and they're looking at how people can come together and have conversations across the political divide. And they're discovering that sort of like everything that we thought we knew about how people come together and work and solve problems is like not correct. And I love that, because it's like basically like you have to establish trust and you have to be open and you have to know a lot about each other. And actually what they're learning is that when you just kind of like focus them on an area that's actually working well, like you find something that they actually agree about, like whether it's like a sports team or the weather, and you focus them on that, that can actually be really effective at just allowing them to see that they can work together. And things don't improve gradually, it's more like a punctuated equilibrium situation where things just sort of like snap into place. That really, it really underlies what we're thinking, but I do want to acknowledge like how difficult and careful and deliberate that work needs to be.
I think one of the problems is that we expect it to happen immediately. Like, we will be able to do this in 5 minutes or in 50 minutes or 75 minutes, whatever the class period is. We will be able to do it even in 16 weeks. So I've worked with alternative dispute resolution mechanisms rooted in indigenous knowledge, and it's establishing trust through work. So you spend a lot of time together, knee-deep in mud, working together. And then it doesn't really matter if you're Monsanto and against GMOs, right? At some point, everybody is working together, but that is a different culture.
So these two questions are coming at something from very different angles, but I'm going to give you both of them because I think they pair well together. The first one, when it comes to intense emotions towards symbols that are polarizing in America today, I often see already strong views become radicalized. How do we control the current effects which threaten harm without completely limiting or banning certain symbols? That's the first question. And the second one, in history, have we seen many symbols that were created with negative connotation but have been taken by the targeted community and changed to mean something positive? If so, how long does this process take? When it comes to intense emotions towards symbols that are polarizing in America today, I often see already strong views become radicalized. How do we control the current effects which threaten harm without completely limiting or banning certain symbols?
In terms of, this is a little bit my wheelhouse. In terms of preventing radicalization, one of the things that we know is critical to that process is keeping people engaging in viewpoints that are different from the ones that they already hold. The way people radicalize is they basically stop talking to people that they disagree with, and they only talk to people who have the same viewpoints, and then they even, radicalization is when they become so extreme that even if they're on kind of fringe movement, the fringe has kicked them out, and so they're only talking to a tiny, tiny group of people. And so we know that to prevent that from happening, you have to expose them to wide amount of information. And in fact, there's a lot of evidence that once a formerly radicalized person sees, and cults is a great example, former members of cults actually get to interact with people outside of the cult, their minds change very quickly. And so I think that's an answer to the first one. And ironically, it sort of has the, what would work is making sure that there's lots of information about symbols available so that people can get access to lots of information.
So it's kind of funny that we're because I was going to say, from the philosophical point of view, it would be to have everybody take ethics, and I know that sounds really self-serving, or courses that challenge viewpoints, courses where the goal is to really challenge yourself in a safe space, and to leave maybe just critically thinking, that being exposed, like you said, to different. Or liberal arts education. Let's go with that.
That's good. I think that's good. That sounds good.
Liberal arts education.
There's so much evidence from political psychology that your ability to take into account other people's perspectives and your ability to know a lot about a little bit of a lot of different stuff really protects against taking these sort of extremist views.
There's a reason why Hindu scholars make you argue the other side.
And the other question, are you aware of symbols that had negative connotations that have been turned around by the targeted group?
I don't know about symbols, but words.
Yeah.
Queer. When I was growing up, queer was not the word you used, and now it's been reclaimed. Witch, to a certain extent. Witchcraft was, super negative, and now witches are taking it back and you're not a witch. And that's good. Right.
The big triangle.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. I mean, look, you're Christian, the cross, let's face it. I mean, that's weird, right? An instrument of torture and death, and people wear it around their neck, that's little crystals and silver. That's really weird. You don't think that's weird, man. I mean, it's super weird, right? Hey, I'm walking around with an electric chair thing around my neck. I'd be, look at me funny. But I mean, how does that happen? I don't know. That's a good question. But yeah.
So then one final question, this is actually for Dr. Hairboth. Do you think that transmitter cultures are more invested in symbols than listening cultures?
Probably not on the whole. It's probably, my guess is that there's a lot of factors that go into symbol use, and probably symbol use is fairly equal. It's very dense across all cultures. But I do think what's worth paying attention to in transmitter versus listener-oriented cultures is just how much we want to put our own stuff out there as opposed to being sensitive to how other people might be responding. And what I hope we consider is as the world moves toward more strong individualism, we're losing that sense of how it impacts other people, which again we know from research that it's real.
So I think we'll conclude the questions at this point. I want to thank the panel for all of your insights and the wisdom that you have brought to this group today. First of all, thank you all. I also want to thank all of you for coming and to sticking around, the great questions that you've been asking. We have another panel coming up for Elias on February 23rd, again in this space at 7 p.m., on the moral and ethical questions of policing in the 21st century. Thank you all for coming out tonight. Have a wonderful evening.